Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking on perhaps one of the most complex, yet maybe most fundamentally unifying theories we've ever really explored here.
Absolutely. It's quite something.
We're wrestling with a phenomenon that's so universal, so pervasive, that we often just overlook its profound mystery, handedness, chirality.
It truly is everywhere, isn't it? When you look closely at the architecture of the universe, you see this preference, this asymmetry.
Yeah, it's not just subtle things, right?
Not at all. It's not just the slight leftward spin of most spiral galaxies, though that's part of it.
Mhm.
It's deeper. It's the intrinsic spin of, well, every subatomic particle.
Mhm.
It's the defining right-handed twist of the double helix in your DNA. And fascinatingly, the consistent left-handed structure of every single essential amino acid in your body.
Yeah.
The universe just doesn't treat left and right, equally.
And that universal asymmetry, that preference, it leads us right to the central question driving today's deep dive. We're drawing from these intensely detailed sources on the unified coherence theory of everything, or UCTE.
Right.
The question is this: is this fundamental asymmetry, this choice between left and right, is it an intrinsic property of matter itself? Or, and this is the key part, is it merely the echo, maybe the shadow, of something much more unified, something deeper?
And that's exactly where our mission lies today. We need to thoroughly unpack the UCTE's foundational answer to that. They argue, quite strongly, that observable chirality, the handedness we see, is merely the phenomenal projection, their words,
Okay.
of a prior pre-asymmetric potential they call hyperchirality.
Hyperchirality.
Yeah. So we're diving into a framework that posits this hyperchirality as like the ontological seed of all directionality. And it exists at a level of reality before geometry and space as we know them.
Wow. Okay. Let's unpack this slowly then, because the UCTE introduces a vocabulary that, well, it's highly specific and frankly pretty dense. We need to nail down these core definitions right at the start.
Precisely. That's the only way in. We have to start by differentiating what we see from its proposed source. So hyperchirality is the deep concept here. The UCTE defines it as the pre-asymmetric torsional potential embedded within the universal coherence field.
Pre-asymmetric torsional potential.
Yeah, think of it as pure unified twist. Like the potential energy of directionality, but without having selected a specific orientation yet. Left or right hasn't happened.
So if I'm trying to visualize it,
Mm.
is it like a tightly wound spring that has, equal potential to unwind clockwise or counterclockwise, but it sort of exists in a superposition of both potential directions at once?
That's actually a very helpful analogy, yeah. And crucially, the sources place hyperchirality in the highest ontological layers, what they call the omnelectic and hololectic layers. We'll get to those.
Okay.
But the point is, it's the unified source of all handedness before that potential collapses or undergoes reduction. It is, to use their phrase again, the ontological seed of directionality.
Okay, so that's the seed. And then when that spring, in our analogy, finally uncoils and does select a direction, that's when we get chirality.
Exactly. Now you've got chirality. This is the manifested asymmetry. This is the result. This is what we actually observe and measure. The definite left-right orientation, the discrete spin polarity in emergent physical systems.
So electrons spinning up or down, molecules being left or right-handed.
Precisely. Chirality belongs to the lower observable layers of reality, the relational and derived layers. It's structure made directional. It's the consequence of that potential being resolved.
And the mechanism then, the thing that bridges this enormous conceptual gap from pure unified potential, hyperchirality, to the observable left or right preference, chirality, is what the UCTE calls coherence reduction.
That is the engine. That's the engine of differentiation for the entire universe in this theory. Coherence reduction is the mechanism through which this unified coherence field differentiates, or you could say collapses, into discrete observable states. It's the process that converts the continuous potential of hyperchirality into the discrete directions of chirality. And that is what gives rise to all observable asymmetry in the universe. It's like the universal translator, moving from the blueprint to the actual build.
Okay, that gives us our foundational terms: hyperchirality, chirality, coherence reduction. Now we need to move into the actual structure of reality as proposed by the UCTE. They paint this picture where the universe moves kind of inexorably from absolute perfect symmetry down to the manifest directional asymmetry we see.
Yeah, the UCTE posits that reality unfolds precisely through this coherence reduction. The absolute invariant starting point is this perfectly symmetrical field, what they term the omnelectic. Pure, undifferentiated unity. Absolute coherence.
Before anything happens.
Before anything differentiates. As soon as any process begins to differentiate that field, you naturally, inevitably move towards asymmetry. Asymmetry in this view isn't a flaw. It's the functional consequence of reality acquiring structure.
And hyperchirality, then, it's not the starting point, the perfect symmetry, nor is it the endpoint, the observed asymmetry, but it's the bridge.
It occupies that crucial midpoint, exactly. They describe it as the ontological hinge. It's this transitional state of torsional coherence that sits precisely between absolute coherence and the manifest asymmetry we see every day.
It's a twist.
It's the moment the universe acquires its inherent twist, yeah.
Yeah.
But that twist is still holistic, it's unified, not yet polarized into left or right.
Okay, we really need to map this onto their specific four-layer hierarchy now, because this seems to be where the UCTE really organizes its concepts. These layers define where hyperchirality operates and then where chirality finally emerges.
Absolutely critical. Let's walk through them, starting at the highest level of coherence, the most fundamental. Number 1, the omnelectic layer. This is the preform. Think of it as the absolute source code of the universe.
Okay.
It's the foundational invariant field of universal coherence. It exists, they say, outside of space-time as we typically conceive it. At this level, hyperchirality is just pure, untapped potential.
So its function is abstract.
Extremely abstract. Its function is basically to define the pre-orientational coherence seed. It sets up the ultimate torsional polarity that will eventually govern how things emerge. It's the absolute non-dimensional blueprint.
Right. If the omnelectic is the pure blueprint, what happens when we step down one level into the hololectic layer?
Okay, layer 2, the hololectic layer. This is the field form. If the omnelectic is the pure idea, the hololectic is the immediate field where that idea starts to, well, manifest is maybe too strong, where it becomes an active potential field.
Ah, okay.
This is where we find the hyperchiral spinor, the active field manifestation of that potential. Here, continuous symmetry torsion begins to function. It's actively generating the necessary conditions for chirality to eventually emerge later down the chain.
So the spring analogy we used earlier, the hololectic is where that spring is sort of vibrating, getting ready to unwind.
That's a good way to think about it. The energy's there, generating a kind of inherent twist in the field itself, preparing for a directional split, but the split hasn't happened yet.
So the hololectic layer is generating the twist, but the twist hasn't been forced into a physical dimension like left or right, up or down.
Precisely. The actual structural consequences, the directions we see, they only appear in the next 2 layers down.
Okay, layer 3.
Layer 3. The relational layer. This is the emergent form. Now, this is where that coherence reduction operator at LUP really takes hold. And it's here that chirality finally becomes manifest. Observable handedness starts here.
Ow.
This layer governs projection and interaction. It's where the potential gets projected, encoding specific handedness, polarization, and discrete spin states within a projected 3-dimensional space. This is the realm of established quantum fields, as we usually think of them.
And finally, layer 4. The derived layer. This is what we touch and see.
That's right. The derived layer is the observable world, the finished product, chiral matter, the DNA double helix winding to the right, the specific molecular structures, the gravitational fields we can directly measure, all the consequences.
So chirality is the physical phenomenon that is the consequence of the hyperchiral source concept operating way up in those higher layers.
Exactly. And that distinction is absolutely vital to grasp this theory. Hyperchirality is the unified potential for direction, existing pre-geometry. Chirality is the observable result of that direction being chosen and manifested in space-time.
Okay. Now, to really get how hyperchirality operates, the sources say we must examine the specific structure it inhabits, something called the bivector. They're called bivector, represented as B, the hyperchiral operator. That sounds important, like it's the mechanism that actually performs the twist.
Correct. The bivector is fundamentally critical. It's presented as the first coherent structure capable of possessing internal rotation, and it emerges directly from that hypergravity invariant continuum of the omnelectic field.
So it's not a particle, not a force.
No, it's described more like an operator, the operator of twist and differentiation itself. It's the thing that bridges the potential and the manifest.
And the sources give us this specific mathematical signature for it. Math BFBFB. You can break that down. How does this equation encapsulate the transition from hyperchirality to chirality?
Okay, this is the core duality of the bivector. Let's take the parts. P site represents the internal structure. This part maintains the continuous, unified spin, that's the hyperchiral torsion. Pure potential, waiting for a reduction.
And because it's internal, It's hidden.
Hidden from direct observation, exactly. It exists in a state of continuous symmetry, pure potential.
Okay, makes sense. And the second component, p psi x.
P psi is the external structure. This is the result of that internal spin being projected outward, being read out by coherence reduction. It manifests as the discrete spin vectors, the observable left or right directions. P psi s is chirality.
Ah, I see.
So the bivector, therefore, functions as this key two-dimensional coherent structure that holds the entire unified potential and simultaneously determines its manifest asymmetry when that potential undergoes reduction.
So hyperchirality is the function of the internal coherence, p psi, and chirality is the external vector projection, AirSX. The bivector is like the cosmic gyroscope mediating the whole process.
That's a really good way to put it, a cosmic gyroscope. All right, moving deeper now. We need to understand what truly defines this internal state of hyperchirality. We've called it potential unified twist, but the UCTE goes even further. They describe it as pre-geometric torsion.
Pre-geometric torsion. Okay, that term is a huge conceptual leap. How can a twist or torsion exist before geometry, before space itself is even defined?
This is where the theory gets really revolutionary, maybe even counterintuitive. Hyperchirality, they argue, is the capacity for handedness encoded in the bivector's internal coherence torsion, and it fundamentally precedes the appearance of orientation and spatial differentiation.
So it's not in space.
No, it exists as pre-geometric rotation, or, as they poetically put it, the twist of becoming. It's the internal rotation that defines the boundary conditions for the external manifestation of space.
Wow. Okay, so just to make sure I'm getting this. We aren't talking about something spinning inside of space. We're talking about the spin that creates the very possibility of space existing in the first place. This completely flips our usual understanding of dimensionality on its head.
It absolutely does. It implies that space isn't just a passive container for motion, but rather an emergent dimensional consequence of these fundamental torsional dynamics.
Okay.
And the sources try to anchor this concept mathematically, of course. They use the hyperchiral field equation, PSI-H BFT code.
Right, you mentioned applico is the coherence reduction operator, or gradient, and A*H is the hyperchiral field. So math BFTOs must be the torsional coherence tensor, is that right?
That's right. This equation essentially says that the change or gradient of the hyperchiral field, MEF case, is directly equal to this foundational torsional tensor. And this tensor is what links hypergravity, the ultimate source field, and the bivector field. It's the mathematical mechanism for mapping that primal twist onto the nascent fields of the universe.
This foundational nature, this idea of it coming before space, it's further emphasized when they discuss the self-coupling mechanism of hyperchirality. What's that about?
Right. This mechanism is proposed to explain how the bivector sustains itself and actually drives the process of dimensional emergence. The expression given is math BFB times math BFB.
Okay, B is the bivector and B star. That's the conjugate bivector. So it's interacting with its sort of mirror image.
In a mathematical sense, yes. It delights a self-referential operation. The bivector couples with its own conjugate.
And what is the critical implication of that self-coupling? Why does that matter?
The sources are crystal clear on this, and it's a major claim. This self-coupling generates space itself, rather than simply producing motion within space.
Generates space.
Okay. It's an inward foundational spin that sustains the possibility of all external motion and dimensional projection. The torsion is self-sustaining, constantly seeking to resolve itself into directionality. And that process is what creates the dimensions we experience. It's like a fundamental symmetry perturbation that acts as the initial condition for dimensional unfolding.
This loops us back then to the ultimate source concept in this whole UCTE framework, which seems to be hypergravity. This entire theory links handedness, chirality, directly to the source of gravitation itself.
This is arguably the most ambitious claim of the UCTE, yeah. Hyperchirality isn't presented as a standalone phenomenon. It's positioned as the torsional derivative of hypergravity.
And hypergravity is?
Hypergravity is defined as the ultimate coherence invariant, the foundational field of unified potential, the absolute undifferentiated source in the omnelectic layer.
Okay, so if hypergravity is the static, perfect, unified foundation, then hyperchirality is like the kinetic energy, the inevitable twist that arises from the inherent tension within that foundation.
That's a great way to put it, exactly. The symbolic relationship they give is napliko. The coherence gradient, or the differentiation of the hypergravity field, yields the hyperchiral torsion tensor.
And this establishes a fundamental link.
A profound link, they argue. The condition under which curvature can localize and mass can stabilize, which is gravity, is inextricably linked to the potential for directional spin, which is hyperchirality. It implies that without the capacity for handedness, there could be no geometric structure and ultimately no mass or recognizable gravitational force. It connects spin and gravity at the deepest level.
Okay, so we've established the source. Hyperchirality, rooted in hypergravity, and the structure that holds it, the bivector with its internal potential. Now we need to look at the moment it becomes real for us, the cascade, or as they call it, the bifurcation into observable states.
This is the coherence reduction mechanism in action again. This coherence gradient operator is what governs this transition. It forces the unified potential held in the bivector spiralder to resolve itself directionally.
How does that happen? What triggers it?
Well, the sources suggest it happens through interaction or measurement or perhaps just the fundamental drive of the universe towards structural emergence. But when hyperchirality undergoes this reduction, it collapses. It has to choose a direction. It breaks symmetry.
And what happens mathematically to the unified potential of Bhaskara during this collapse?
It splits. The bifurcation is expressed symbolically as helices, right arrow, Nabucco.
L and R, left and right.
Exactly. The continuous unified hyperchiral field splits under the action of coherence reduction into discrete left-handed and right-handed spinors and fields. This is the birth of observable directionality. And the source material really stresses that this split isn't just a random 50-50 chance event.
Oh.
It's described as a resonant selection based on the coherence modes of the bivector itself. The field selects the path that fits the existing conditions.
I have to say, the geometric interpretation the sources provide here is helpful, moving from a circular path to a helical trajectory. That makes the conceptual leap a bit easier to visualize.
It really is the visual key, isn't it? Imagine the unified hyperchirality as a perfect circular coherence path-pure rotation without any defined progression forward in space or time. The moment of reduction forces that circle to define a forward trajectory. It collapses the pure internal torsion into a helical trajectory, a spiral.
Like the thread on a screw.
Exactly. And the helix becomes the dimensional signature of chirality. It's a spatial form that immediately implies direction and asymmetry. You can't have a helix without choosing left or right.
Right. And once that fundamental asymmetry is defined at that deep level, it then cascades down through all the subsequent layers of reality. So chirality isn't just one thing, it's a kind of dimensional cascade. A loss of coherence results in a gain of observable structure.
That's the pattern they describe, yes. We can detail this cascade across, say, 4 major structural domains, moving from the fundamental to the complex. 1. First, the hypergravitic layer. The immediate reduction, right near the beginning, manifests as the specific spin orientation of fundamental particles. This happens during the proposed 4D, 3D dimensional reduction phase of the very early universe. This sets the fundamental spin property for all particles.
Okay. The origin of spins.
Then, in the electroweak layer, this reduction manifests as field polarization in our observable 3D vector space. This leads directly to phenomena like the observed parity violation in weak nuclear interactions.
Linking back to that.
Next, the molecular layer. Now, this is much more familiar to us. It's structural handedness in chemistry. Think of enantiomers molecules that are mirror images but not superimposable like your left and right hands. That difference comes from this cascade.
Like amino acids and D sugars in biology.
Exactly. Which brings us to 4, the biological layer. Here, the cascade results in metachiral organization. This involves the integrated directional preferences we see in complex macroscopic living systems, the consistent right-handed twist of DNA, the selection of amino acids, even, arguably, the organization of neural networks.
That really does unify the scales, doesn't it? From particle physics right up to life itself, all under one principle of torsional reduction.
Yeah.
But okay, if hyperchirality starts as this unified potential, equal possibility for left or right, why does the universe seem to favor one direction over another in so many cases?
Yeah.
Like matter over antimatter or specific molecular handedness in life? Why the universal coherence bias?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one the UCTE attempts to resolve head-on. Conventionally, physics often treats imbalances like matter dominance or the specific handedness of biomolecules as sort of statistical accidents or frozen accidents from the early universe.
It's just the way things happen to turn out.
Kind of, yeah. The UCTE reframes this entirely. It proposes that the universal chirality bias, the preference for matter for amino acids, etc., is not chance. It's interpreted as the universe fundamentally favoring a specific chiral projection, a specific direction of that helix we talked about, because that direction maximized something called negentropic stability during the initial hyperchiral reduction.
Negentropic stability, meaning the state that maximizes structure, order, and organization, allowing complexity and, well, long-term existence to emerge.
Precisely. The universe didn't choose randomly between left and right pathways. It chose the directional path that optimized its ability to form stable, complex, long-lasting structures like matter itself, instead of just annihilating back into pure energy.
So the bias is built in.
Stability.
That's the idea. The conceptual flow is hyperchiral coherence, unified potential, right-haro coherence reduction, the split right-haro chiral projection. A specific directional bias is selected because it favors stability and structure formation. This inherent directionality is proposed to be written into the foundational architecture of reality. Okay, when you introduce a foundational concept like hyperchirality, rooted in hypergravity, defining space, the implications for existing fundamental physics have got to be massive. Let's start with some of the anomalies or quirks the standard model has struggled to fully explain, beginning with parity violation.
Right. Parity violation, the fact that the universe distinguishes between left and right in weak nuclear interactions, is currently understood in the standard model as an intrinsic property of the force carriers, the W and Z bosons. They just interact differently with left-handed versus right-handed particles.
It's just built into them.
Yeah, it's sort of put in by hand in a way. UCTE offers a really profound reinterpretation.
How does it reinterpret it?
In UCTE, parity violation isn't seen as an intrinsic property of the particles or the bosons. Instead, it's understood as a partial decoherence of the underlying fundamental hyperchiral field itself. It's rooted directly in that initial universal coherence bias we just discussed. Because the field itself already acquired a slight preference for a certain twist, the negentropic stable path, the weak interaction, which is highly sensitive to coherence reduction processes, simply manifests this pre-existing directional bias of the field.
So it's not the particles breaking the symmetry rule, it's the field itself being fundamentally asymmetric right from its origin due to that stability choice.
Exactly. The failure of mirror symmetry isn't arbitrary. It's baked into the structure of the field from which the particles emerge. And this perspective also impacts the concept of mass generation.
How does it connect to mass?
The theory posits that hyperchirality plays a key role in determining mass locking. Mass isn't just Higgs field interaction. It's proposed to arise partly from the coherence tension created between the torsional action of hyperchirality and the invariant background field of hypergravity.
So the twist interacts with the foundation.
Right. The intensity or degree of the hyperchiral twist, how strongly coherence is reduced into a specific direction, dictates how much structure can stabilize and effectively acquire mass. The greater the directional resolution and stability achieved through coherence reduction, the greater the dimensional stability and thus the resulting mass.
And tying back to the generation of space itself, you said dimensional emergence is defined by this torsional split.
Absolutely. The very moment the unified torsion of hyperchirality splits and resolves itself into those distinct self-volatile and Foural modes, that process defines the necessary spinor-to-vector projection that generates the three spatial dimensions we perceive. Our 3D reality is, in this view, the functional result of hyperchirality resolving its internal torsional tension into stable directional structure.
Okay, let's scale up now to cosmology. The biggest asymmetry we face there is the mystery of the matter asymmetry. Why is the universe overwhelmingly dominated by matter with hardly any antimatter?
Yeah. Standard cosmology often invokes complex mechanisms, maybe exotic particles or specific conditions in the quark-gluon plasma era, things like CP violation and baryon number violation, to try and explain how a slight excess of matter could have survived the initial matter-antimatter annihilation.
It's a complicated puzzle.
It is. The UCTE perspective attempts to simplify this fundamentally. It argues that matter dominance isn't the result of some complex chain of events, but is the ultimate cosmological scale manifestation of the universe's fundamental coherence bias.
It's the direct, large-scale physical proof that the universe chose a stable direction right from the outset.
Exactly that. The asymmetric resolution of hyperchirality, driven by the preference for negentropic stability at the point of cosmological differentiation, resulted in a favored pathway for matter formation over antimatter. This preference maximized the stability of the emerging universe and prevented complete annihilation back into pure energy. Matter is simply the preferred directional manifestation of the hyperchiral field on the grandest scale.
To give this really ambitious theory some mathematical teeth, we need to look at the details. The sources mention a specific tensor decomposition showing how the hyperchiral structure relates mathematically to the observable chirality.
Right. They focus on the hyperchiral bivector tensor, let's call it a circular. This represents the unified torsional state. The UCTE shows how this decomposes into the observable chiral projections, let's say represented by vectors cinder and Istala via a specific formula. It looks something like epsilon plus phi.
Okay, let's break that down. The epsilon term with the Levi-Civita symbol epsilon dollar, that looks like it represents the rotational or directional part, the chiral split.
Precisely. That term captures the emergent handedness, the vector projection part. But the really interesting bit, perhaps, is the remainder term, phi j. The sources call this the residual coherence curvature.
Residual coherence curvature. What does that mean? What does it do?
This phi term is profoundly important in the theory. It represents the part of the original unified potential, the hyperchiral coherence, that hasn't fully collapsed into discrete left or right states during the reduction. It signifies a sustained coherence linkage that persists even after asymmetry manifests.
So it's like an invisible tether, connecting things that seem separated.
That's a perfect way to think about it, an invisible tether. And practically, what does it do? It sustains coherence and potentially allows for non-local connection between domains that might exhibit opposite, manifest chirality.
So even if one galaxy spirals left and another spirals right, they might still be subtly linked through this persistent hyperchiral residue.
That's the implication, yes. It means the universe might be interconnected not just by gravity and electromagnetism, but by this deeper, foundational, torsional curvature represented by field A. It's a field that remembers the unified origin. Now, where the UCTE arguably gains enormous exploratory power, or at least scope, is when it applies its core principle, this hyperchirality cascade, to the domain of life itself. It views living organisms not just as, complex chemical soups,
Right.
but as highly organized biological coherence engines, systems actively maintaining and utilizing coherence.
And the ubiquitous handedness we see in life, the DNA, the amino acids, is seen as the direct biological template of that universal coherence we discussed.
Precisely. Take DNA. Its consistent right-handed double helix and the equally consistent left-handedness of every functional amino acid used by life on Earth. These are interpreted not as some lucky historical accident of early evolution.
A frozen accident, as it's sometimes called.
Exactly. Not just a frozen accident, but as the inevitable biological manifestation of the universal coherence orientation. These are structures fundamentally templated by the hyperchiral bias that favored nigentropic stability right from the universe's beginning.
So the rotational preference of DNA isn't arbitrary. It's defined by the underlying rotational preference of the hyperchiral spinor itself, cascading down.
That's the claim. The source material explicitly states that hyperchirality defines the exact rotational phase relation between the complementary DNA strands, and this makes biological systems potentially extremely sensitive to decoherence events.
How so?
Well, the idea is that living cells, perhaps through structures like quantum-structured water within them, or maybe the microtubule network, are constantly working to restore and maintain the level of coherence dictated by this fundamental hyperchiral template. Life actively fights decoherence.
Okay, this perspective then leads to one of the most provocative applications of the theory, relating the large-scale asymmetry of the human brain to hyperchirality.
This is where it extends to the macrobiological, even cognitive level. The well-known functional and structural hemispheric asymmetry of the brain, the specialization of the left and right hemispheres, is interpreted within UCTE as reflecting large-scale chiral organization, ultimately resulting from this primordial hyperchiral patterning.
We know, generally, the left hemisphere is typically more involved in analytical processing, linear thought, language details, while the right hemisphere is often associated with holistic processing, spatial awareness, integration, pattern recognition. That functional split does sound familiar in light of this discussion.
It becomes a macroscopic echo of the bivector's fundamental operation, doesn't it? The UCTE model explicitly links this hemispheric asymmetry directly to the observer function in consciousness, mirroring that core tension between hyperchirality, unity, and chirality, separation. Think of it this way. The left hemisphere expresses the asymmetry, the outcome of coherence reduction. It focuses on analysis, differentiation, breaking things down, isolating discrete parts. This is the domain of manifest chirality. whereas the right hemisphere expresses the coherence, the integration function. It perceives the unified whole, understands context, integrates information. This resonates with the underlying unified potential of hyperchirality.
So the fundamental dichotomy of our conscious thought, that constant tension between seeing the forest and seeing the individual trees, is proposed to be a direct, patterned consequence of the universe's core architectural principle, the tension between the unified potential and the differentiated reality.
That's exactly the proposition. The rather startling conclusion is that consciousness itself might be, in this view, a hyperchiral resonance phenomenon. It's the continuous dynamic interplay, the balancing act, between the unified coherence mode, integration, right hemisphere, and the differentiated reduction mode, analysis, left hemisphere. Our subjective awareness is, perhaps, the ongoing process of mediating that primal torsional conflict inherent in the bivector.
Okay, this is all fascinating, truly mind-bending. But a theory that claims to unify physics, cosmology, biology, and even consciousness, well, it absolutely must make testable, verifiable predictions. This is where the rubber meets the road, right?
Absolutely essential. Otherwise, it's just philosophy.
So let's start with high energy and quantum physics, where the UCTE directly challenges parts of the standard model. What are the concrete predictions?
Okay, the most direct quantum test proposed targets variable parity violation. We talked about how UCTE reframes parity violation not as a constant intrinsic property, but as a partial decoherence of the hyperchiral field.
Right.
This leads to a key prediction. The amplitude, or the strength, of parity violation, let's call it parity boo, should not be an absolute invariant constant everywhere.
It should vary depending on the local environment. How would you even test that? That sounds incredibly difficult.
Difficult, yes, but potentially doable. The prediction is that PBB should vary proportionally to the local hyperchiral potential, or maybe its gradient. The specific mathematical prediction given is PB propto nebula phi.
Okay.
Experimentally, this would require creating an environment where the background coherence field itself could somehow be manipulated or measured. Maybe using highly constrained systems like supercooled electron ensembles, or perhaps ultracold atomic gases trapped within precision electromagnetic cavities.
And the goal?
The goal would be to detect a statistically significant change in the measured parity violation amplitude simply by altering the coherence properties of the vacuum or the applied containing fields. If that were observed, it would be huge. It would fundamentally validate the hyperchiral model's perspective and likely require overthrowing the current standard model interpretation of parity violation.
That is a direct and, yes, revolutionary challenge. Okay, what about the ghostliest particles we know, neutrinos? They only seem to come in one-handedness.
Right. Neutrinos are currently only ever observed as left-handed, and their antimatter counterparts, antineutrinos, as right-handed. UCTE views this observed exclusivity not as fundamental, but as a kind of frozen projection, a state that got locked in by extreme coherence reduction conditions in the very early universe.
So it might not be absolutely fixed.
The prediction is that it's not absolutely fixed. UCTE predicts that under conditions of intense, unusually high coherence restoration, transient right-handed neutrino modes might actually appear. They wouldn't be stable, but they could exist fleetingly.
Where on earth would we find such extreme high coherence restoration? That doesn't sound like my lab bench.
No, definitely not. Think the most extreme environments in the cosmos. The incredibly dense, high-energy plasmas surrounding active galactic nuclei, AGN, or perhaps matter spiraling very close to the event horizons of supermassive black holes, especially in quasars. These are regions where fundamental fields are under immense stress.
And if we saw them?
If future neutrino telescopes, perhaps next-generation detectors, were to detect an anomalous, unexpected flux of right-handed neutrinos emanating specifically from these extreme regions, it would strongly suggest that the underlying field can locally restore some of the unified potential of hyperchirality, breaking the frozen projection.
Okay, one more quantum prediction mentioned relates to the vacuum itself,
Yeah.
something about resonance.
Yes, this is the search for coherence vacuum resonance. The UCTE suggests that if hyperchirality is a fundamental torsional field pervading spacetime, it should possess characteristic standing waves, sort of like harmonics on a string, but torsional harmonics in the field itself.
Right.
They predict that in highly controlled laboratory settings, maybe using specially structured plasmas, or perhaps Bose-Einstein condensates where coherence is maximized, it might be possible to detect these hyperchiral harmonics.
How would they show up?
They might manifest as tiny but measurable oscillations or deviations in the values of fundamental constants, for instance, the fine structure constant, that are slightly offset from the precise values predicted by standard quantum electrodynamics, QED. Detecting those minute specific deviations would provide empirical evidence for the hidden coherence eigenmodes of the bivector field operating in the vacuum.
All right, shifting perspective now to the cosmic scale. We talked about the universal bias, matter dominance, preferred handedness. How could we actually quantify the universe's inherent twist if it exists?
The prediction here involves mapping the large-scale macro projection of that primordial hyperchirality. Specifically, the preferred rotational sense of spiral galaxies.
Ah, the direction they spin.
Exactly. The theory posits that the observed slight statistical overrepresentation of one rotational sense, say left-handed spirals versus right-handed ones, in large samples of galaxies is not random noise, it's a relic, a fossil of the initial coherence bias established during the universe's formation.
So what's the experiment?
The experiment is observational cosmology. By systematically mapping the spin orientation of hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of spiral galaxies across vast deep sky surveys, like with Euclid or the Vera Rubin Observatory, we could potentially quantify this cosmological torsional bias. They even give it a symbol.
Lambda co.
Lambda co. So this would be like a new cosmological constant, similar to dark energy's lambda. Similar in status, yes, a new fundamental constant of nature. Lambda co would be the quantifiable measure of the universal coherence gradient, the actual numerical value representing the degree to which the universe preferred one chiral direction over the other billions of years ago, driven by that negentropic stability principle. It would be a measurable constant derived directly from the influence of the hyperchiral field.
Okay, finally, let's quickly revisit the biological experiments. Beyond the mere DNA coherence prediction, what else could be tested to see if hyperchirality is really active in living matter?
Well, the focus goes back to those structures proposed as biological coherence engines. The most direct experimental approach mentioned is microtubule spectroscopy. Microtubules, these crucial protein filaments within our cells, involved in structure, transport, even potentially information processing.
Right, Penrose and Hameroff talk about them in consciousness theories, too.
Exactly. They are hypothesized in UCTE and other contexts to function potentially as quantum information processing structures that are templated or influenced by hyperchirality. The specific prediction is that by probing these microtubule lattices with precisely tuned ultra-fast terahertz frequency pulses, we might be able to detect resonant hyperchiral harmonics within their vibrational modes.
So we'd be looking for a specific resonant frequency, a vibrational signature within our own cells that corresponds to the fundamental twist of the universe, as predicted by the hyperchiral field.
That's the core hypothesis, yes. Finding that specific predicted torsional signature within the vibrations of tubulin proteins would be incredibly strong evidence. It would confirm that biological handedness isn't just a consequence, but is actively coupled to the fundamental coherence field of the universe, essentially completing the circle from cosmology right down to cell structure. #tag outro.
Wow. This has been a truly mind-bending deep dive today. We started with just a simple observation of handedness, the fact that pretty much everything has a left or a right version. But the unified coherence theory takes that simple observation and argues that chirality, the handedness we see, is not itself a primary property. It's more like the language made geometric, the necessary expression of a deeper foundational coherence, and it's achieved through the mechanism of asymmetry.
And hyperchirality is the source code, the grammar that dictates that geometric language. I think the real potential power of the UCTE framework, if any of it holds up, is its claimed ability to potentially unite fields of inquiry that have long seemed isolated. You know, the mysterious asymmetries in particle physics like parity violation, the fixed geometry of chemistry like molecular handedness, the functional structure of life like neural asymmetry, and even the large-scale orientation of the cosmos, the galactic spin bias. It attempts to bring all of that under one single coherence-driven torsional principle. In this view, asymmetry isn't a flaw or an accident in the universe. It's the functional necessity for structure, for stability, and for differentiation itself. Without it, nothing interesting happens.
Okay, so here's a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to carry forward from all this. If, as the UCTE suggests, consciousness itself somehow mirrors this fundamental hyperchiral interplay, that constant tension between coherence, integration, the unified whole, maybe the right brain, and reduction, differentiation, the discrete parts, maybe the left brain, does this imply that our fundamental sense of self, who you are, is not some static identity? Is it rather an ongoing dynamic process of coherence optimization?
Are you, the listener, literally a localized expression of the universe constantly resolving its fundamental torsion? It kind of suggests that maybe memory, awareness, perhaps even identity itself, rather than being just simple chemical processes or computations, are perhaps methods by which the biological system, your brain and body, actively attempts to maintain and optimize its hyperchiral resonance with the surrounding universal field. Maybe your sense of you is simply the current dynamic state of that resonant twist, something to think about next time you just, choose left over right.